The mountain had stood for thousands of years, jagged and cold, its peaks hidden in clouds that never seemed to leave. The elves called it the Skyfang, and they said no one could climb it. Not humans, not elves, not even the strongest creatures of the land. To the elves, it was a barrier, a place of mystery, and a test that no outsider could pass. Rylan, a young human scout, stood at the base of the mountain. He looked up at the sharp ridges and sheer cliffs, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. He was not a soldier, not a wizard, just a human who had learned to think and observe carefully. But humans were clever, and Rylan had a mind that never stopped working. Where others saw danger, he saw patterns. Where others saw walls, he saw paths. The elves laughed when they saw him. From their high cliffs, their golden armor glinting in the sun, they watched the small human at the bottom of their mountain. "He cannot climb that," one said, shaking his head. "No human has ever done it. He will fall before night." Rylan did not answer. Words from elves meant little to him. He had heard their warnings, felt their disbelief, and learned not to care. He had a mission. The Human Confederation needed maps of the northern passes, maps that would allow trade and travel. The Skyfang blocked the way, and the elves believed humans could never reach the top. That made the mountain perfect for someone like him. He pulled his cloak tight around his shoulders. The wind was cold and sharp, cutting across the rocks. Rylan studied the mountain carefully. He noticed small ledges, cracks in the stone, and tiny paths that seemed too narrow for anyone to see from afar. He studied the shadows, the sunlight, the way the wind blew. Every step of the climb would need careful thought, but he was ready. The elves continued to watch, murmuring among themselves. "He will fail," they said. "The mountain does not allow humans to survive here." They did not understand that humans were not like them. Humans did not rely only on strength or magic. Humans could think, imagine, and solve problems no one else could. Rylan took his first step onto the rocky slope. The stones under his boots were loose, small pebbles shifting and sliding, but he moved slowly, carefully, testing each hold. He did not rush. He had learned that fear and haste were worse than cold or wind. One wrong move could end the climb, but patience could make the impossible possible. As he climbed higher, the mountain became steeper. Clouds wrapped around him, hiding the peaks, making it hard to see where to go next. The wind howled like a living thing trying to push him back. But Rylan kept moving, using his staff to balance and probe the rocks ahead. Every crack, every ridge became a step in his invisible path. The elves watched in disbelief. He was moving where no human should. Rylan paused on a small ledge to rest. From there he could see the first of the high cliffs. They were almost vertical, smooth in some places, with only tiny cracks for hands or feet. Any normal climber would have given up. But Rylan did not think of himself as normal. He thought of ways to use what he had. Rocks could become steps, cracks could hold a hand if used correctly, and the wind could sometimes help instead of hurt. He thought of every possibility, weighing risks and chances. Below, the elves whispered and frowned. They had never seen such confidence in a human. Most humans were too cautious, too afraid. Rylan was different. He was brave, yes, but more than that, he was clever. He could see things others could not. Where the elves saw a sheer wall, he saw angles. Where they saw danger, he saw solutions. Night began to fall, painting the mountain in silver light. Rylan found a small outcrop to rest for the night. It was narrow, barely enough space to sit, but it was safe. He built a small fire, careful not to let the smoke rise too high, and ate his simple meal. Below him, the elves shook their heads. They expected him to fail, to freeze, to fall. Rylan looked at the stars above and smiled. He thought of the path he would take tomorrow. He thought of every step, every crack, every possibility. To climb the Skyfang, he would need more than strength. He would need patience, courage, and the cleverness that humans were known for. And he had it. The mountain was huge. The climb would be long and dangerous. But Rylan was not afraid. He had faced the impossible before, and he would do it again. One human, one mind, one step at a time. That was all it would take. And so, under the cold light of the moon, Rylan rested, ready to begin the climb that no human had ever completed. The elves could watch and laugh all they wanted. He knew the truth. Humans were made to face challenges that others thought impossible, and sometimes, just sometimes, they could succeed where even the strongest believed failure was certain. Rylan woke before sunrise, the chill biting at his skin. The sky was pale with the first light of morning, and the clouds around the peaks glowed faintly. He packed his small supplies and tested his staff against the rocky ledge he had slept on. Everything was still solid. The climb could begin again. The elves were already watching from above. Their eyes were sharp, trained to spot every movement. They whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. No human could make it this far, said one of the taller elves. He will fail by nightfall, another replied. They did not understand humans. Humans did not give up easily. Humans used their minds to survive. Rylan stepped onto the slope. His boots crunched against the stones, small rocks tumbling down the side of the mountain. He moved slowly, deliberately. Every foothold was tested before he put his weight on it. Every crack in the rock was studied before he grabbed it. One false move could send him falling hundreds of feet, but careful thought could turn even danger into advantage. The wind grew stronger as he climbed. It whipped around him, tugging at his cloak, trying to knock him off balance. Most climbers would have stopped, but Rylan adjusted his stance and let the wind push him in the right direction. He used it to his advantage, leaning into it to stabilize himself on narrow ledges. Humans were clever, he thought. Clever enough to turn a challenge into a tool. Higher and higher he went, the cliffs growing steeper. Some walls seemed almost vertical, smooth and unbroken. But Rylan did not see a wall. He saw possibilities. A tiny crack in the stone became a handhold. A small ledge, barely wide enough for a foot, became a step. He used his staff to test the rock ahead, tapping it lightly to see if it would hold. Sometimes the stones shifted or broke, but he adapted quickly, finding another route without losing ground. The elves murmured in confusion. They had never seen a human move with such precision and patience. How does he do it? One whispered. Another shook his head. Humans are fragile. They should not survive here. But Rylan survived because he thought faster than the mountain could throw danger at him. A sudden gust knocked him sideways and he had to cling to the rock with both hands. Small stones fell past him, clattering down the slope. He held his breath and waited until the wind passed. Then, with slow care, he moved again, gripping cracks and using every part of his body to stay steady. The mountain was trying to test him and he welcomed it. Around midday, the sun broke through the clouds, lighting a narrow ridge ahead. Rylan looked carefully. The ridge was thin with sheer drops on both sides. One wrong step could be fatal. He took a deep breath and placed his foot lightly on the edge. His staff pressed against the rock for balance. Step by step, he moved across the ridge, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. The wind buffeted him, but he leaned into it, letting it push him forward instead of back. The elves watched in disbelief. The human was not falling, not panicking, not making mistakes. He was calculating, moving like he had already thought of every problem before it happened. They had always relied on magic and strength, but this human relied on his mind, and it was enough. Higher still, the mountain became colder. Ice had formed on some ledges, making them slippery and dangerous. Most climbers would have turned back, but Rylan examined each icy patch carefully. Some were thin enough to chip away with his staff, creating footholds. Some were solid enough to step on carefully. He tested each one before committing his weight. Humans were patient. Patience could defeat even the sharpest ice. By evening, Rylan had reached a ledge high above where he had started. From there, he could see the clouds swirling below him, like white oceans hiding the lower slopes. The sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in reds and golds. He paused, catching his breath, and looked at the path he had traveled. Every ledge, every crack, every risk had been overcome. He was higher than any human had ever been, and the summit still waited above him. The elves whispered among themselves, voices low and nervous. They could not understand how a human could survive this climb. Their magic, their knowledge, their centuries of study had failed to show a way. Yet here he was, moving with skill and intelligence that no one had predicted. Rylan set up a small camp on the ledge. It was narrow but safe enough to rest for the night. He ate a small meal and wrapped himself in his cloak, staring at the stars above. He thought about the climb ahead. The most dangerous sections were still to come. Sheer ice walls, narrow ridges, and rock faces that looked impossible. But he was ready. Humans were clever, resourceful, and adaptable. Where others saw death, he saw a path. The wind howled around him, but Rylan smiled. Tomorrow he would climb higher than any human had before. He would face every danger, solve every problem, and step where no human had ever stepped. The mountain had tested him today and he had answered. And Rylan knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Rylan woke to the sharp chill of the mountain air. Clouds wrapped the peaks in white, and the wind rattled his small camp. He packed quickly, checking his staff and ropes. The most dangerous part of the climb was ahead. Steep walls, ice patches, and narrow ledges would test his skill and his patience. Rylan began slowly, placing each foot and hand with care. He moved like a shadow over the rocks, quiet and precise. The elves above watched him, their golden eyes narrowing. "No human can survive this," one whispered. "He will fall on the ice," another said. But humans were not like elves. Humans did not only rely on strength or magic. Humans thought. Humans solved problems. And Rylan was about to prove it. Soon he reached a vertical wall of ice, smooth and glistening in the sunlight. Most climbers would have stopped, afraid of slipping hundreds of feet. Rylan studied it carefully. He noticed small cracks, tiny indentations in the ice that others might have missed. He tested them with his staff. Some were solid. Some were weak. He planned every move before he made it. Step by step he began to climb the wall. His hands were cold, his muscles ached, but he did not rush. He leaned his weight carefully, testing each hold. When a small chunk of ice broke under his grip, he adjusted, finding another crack to hold. The elves above gasped. They had expected him to fall at the first obstacle. Yet here he was, moving steadily, using his mind as much as his strength. As he climbed higher, a sudden gust of wind pushed against him. He gripped the ice tightly and leaned into the wall, letting the wind stabilize him instead of knock him down. Humans could adapt in ways others could not. Where the mountain tried to stop him, he used it to his advantage. Every crack, every ridge, every piece of ice became part of his plan. Rylan noticed another challenge, a series of overhanging rocks that seemed impossible to reach. Most climbers would have tried to go around, wasting time and energy. But Rylan calculated the angles. He shifted his weight, used the staff for leverage, and swung carefully from one small ledge to another. Inch by inch he overcame the overhang. The elves above whispered in disbelief. A human had reached parts of the mountain they believed were untouchable. By midday Rylan paused on a narrow ledge. He could see the clouds below him rolling like white waves. The wind was still strong, cutting at his face and hands. He ate a small portion of his food and rested, testing the rocks ahead with his staff. The path was dangerous, but he saw a way. Patience and planning could defeat even the harshest nature. The next section was a thin ridge with sheer drops on both sides. Ice coated the edges, making each step perilous. Rylan moved slowly, keeping his center of gravity low and his staff pressing against the rock. One slip could be fatal, but he focused on the possibilities, not the danger. His mind mapped the ridge before his feet touched it. Every tiny movement counted, and he adjusted constantly. As he moved, he noticed patterns in the mountain. The ice was thicker in some areas, thinner in others. Some rocks were loose, others solid. He used these patterns to plan his steps, always thinking one or two moves ahead. Humans could see solutions that others could not. Cleverness and observation were as powerful as strength. By evening, Rylan reached a high outcrop, far above where he had camped. His arms ached, his legs trembled, and his face was raw from the cold wind. Yet he smiled. He had passed the deadliest parts of the climb. He had outwitted nature itself, using patience, observation, and careful thinking. The mountain had tried to stop him, but humans were adaptable. Humans were unstoppable when they used their minds. The elves below were silent. They had never expected a human to survive this far. Their centuries of study, their magic, and their skill had failed to produce anyone capable of this. Yet Rylan had done it, not by brute force, not by magic, but by thinking, observing, and adapting. Humans had an advantage no one else could match. Rylan set up a small camp on the ledge. It was narrow, barely enough for him to sit, but safe. He built a small fire, careful to keep the smoke low. As the flames crackled, he looked up at the peaks above. The summit was still far, but he had proven something important. The impossible could be done. One human, using his mind and patience, could overcome obstacles that centuries of magic and skill could not. The wind howled through the mountains trying to push him back, but Rylan felt ready. The mountain was harsh, unyielding, and dangerous, but he understood it in ways the elves could not. He had learned its patterns, its rhythms, and its small weaknesses. Tomorrow he would climb higher than any human had ever climbed. He would face new dangers, but he would face them with the same mind, patience, and courage that had brought him this far. Rylan lay down on the narrow ledge and looked at the stars above. The mountain had tested him today, and he had answered. Humans could survive, humans could adapt, and humans could overcome. The impossible was never permanent. The next day the climb would continue, and Rylan was ready. Rylan woke to a pale light washing over the mountain. The clouds were thinner now, and he could see the peaks more clearly. The summit of Skyfang, the legendary mountain the elves called Unclimbable, loomed above him. It was steep, jagged, and dangerous. But Rylan had climbed this far, and he knew one truth: humans could solve problems others could not. He packed his small supplies and checked his staff. The ledge where he slept was narrow but solid. The wind was strong, tugging at his cloak, and ice covered some of the rocks. But Ryland did not hesitate. Each step, each handhold, each crack in the stone was part of his plan. He moved carefully, deliberately, testing the ground before he put his weight on it. The elves watched from their cliffs below. They had followed his progress for days, and disbelief grew with each step he took. "No human should be this high," one said, shaking his head. "The mountain will take him," another whispered. But Ryland did not rely on luck. He relied on observation, patience, and clever thinking, skills humans had mastered through generations of facing impossible challenges. He reached the final vertical wall before the summit. Smooth, sheer, and shining with ice, it seemed impossible to climb. But Ryland studied it. He noticed tiny cracks, small ridges, and angles no one else could see. He tested each one with his staff, feeling for solid holds. Some broke, others held. Step by step, handhold by handhold, he climbed, moving slowly but steadily. A gust of wind knocked him sideways, and he pressed against the ice, leaning into it, letting it stabilize him. Most climbers would panic. Most humans would fear a fall. But Ryland's mind worked like a map, predicting the mountain's reactions and calculating each move before it happened. He was calm, focused, and precise. The mountain tested him, but he had already learned its rhythm. Halfway up the wall, he encountered a ledge covered in ice. Thin and slippery, it looked impossible to cross. But Ryland did not see danger. He saw a pattern. He used small rocks to chip the ice, creating temporary steps. He pressed his staff into cracks and carefully shifted his weight, moving inch by inch. The elves below gasped in amazement. Their centuries of knowledge had failed to teach anyone this skill. A human was defying the mountain itself. Finally, after hours of careful climbing, Ryland reached the top. He pulled himself over the last ridge and stood upright. The wind roared around him and clouds swirled below, hiding the world beneath in white mist. For a moment he simply looked. The summit was empty, vast, and powerful, stretching higher than any elf city. But Ryland felt no fear. He felt triumph. From below, the elves watched in silence. They could not believe it. The unclimbable mountain had been conquered, not by magic, not by power, but by a human using patience, cleverness, and courage. One man had done what they said no one could. They began to understand that humans were not weak, that humans did not rely on magic or brute strength. Humans could think, and that thinking made them extraordinary. Ryland raised his hand in a small wave, not to show off, but to acknowledge the mountain and the challenge he had faced. Every step, every risk, every careful calculation had led him here. He had survived where others would have failed. He had solved a puzzle no one else could. Humans had proven themselves in a way the elves could not ignore. He looked out over the land below. Rivers sparkled in the sunlight, forests stretched across valleys, and distant mountains rose like waves frozen in stone. From up here, everything looked small, fragile, and yet connected. The mountain had tested him, but humans had a way of rising to the challenge. Observation, intelligence, patience, courage, these were weapons stronger than any sword or spell. Ryland knew his work was not done. He still had to descend, return with maps, and show the Confederation that the northern passes were navigable. But for now he allowed himself to feel the weight of accomplishment. He had climbed the unclimbable. He had done what elves and humans before him had thought impossible. The mountain itself seemed almost to welcome him. Small cracks and ridges, invisible to others, had supported him when he needed them. The wind, harsh and cold, had helped guide him instead of pushing him down. Ryland smiled. The impossible was never truly impossible. It was a challenge waiting for the right mind. As the sun began to set, he planted a small marker at the summit, a simple stone cairn to mark his achievement. It was not for glory but for proof. Proof that humans could face the impossible, solve it, and survive. One day, others would follow, inspired by the path he had carved with his cleverness, patience, and courage. Ryland stayed on the summit until the sky turned gold and purple. He felt a quiet connection to the mountain, to the land, and to every human who had ever faced a challenge and refused to give up. Humans were not the strongest or the fastest. They were clever. They were adaptable. They could outthink problems and overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. And today a human had climbed where no one else could. Ryland descended from the summit slowly, carefully, every step measured. The climb down was dangerous too. The wind was cold, the ice slippery, and the ledges narrow. One wrong move could undo everything he had achieved. But Ryland was human, and humans had a way of surviving where others might fail. He had learned the mountain's secrets on the way up, and now he used that knowledge to move safely downward. The elves watched him from their cliffs. Their silence was different now. Gone was the mocking disbelief of the first days. Now there was awe and a quiet respect. The same humans they had once thought weak, fragile, and incapable, had done what no elf could. Ryland's progress proved that human intelligence, patience, and courage were as strong as magic, maybe stronger. As he reached the lower slopes, Ryland paused to rest. He pulled out his small maps and notes, marking every ledge, crack, and safe path he had used. The Confederation would be able to use this information to travel through the mountains safely, to trade, explore, and grow. The impossible mountain was now mapped, understood, and conquered. Humans had changed the world with nothing but their minds, determination, and careful planning. The elves began to speak among themselves. Some shook their heads, still in disbelief, but others whispered approval. "He has done what none of us imagined," one said. "Perhaps humans are not so weak after all." They had assumed humans were small, fragile, and limited. Now they realized something important. Humans could think, adapt, and act in ways no magic or strength could match. The elves had ruled the mountains for centuries, but now they saw a new truth. Humans were extraordinary. Ryland continued down, moving with confidence, though his body was tired and sore. He passed cliffs and ridges he had studied before, checking each one for hazards. He helped himself with his staff, sometimes using loose stones as steps, other times relying on natural grips. The mountain still demanded respect, but Ryland had learned to work with it instead of against it. That was human skill, seeing opportunity where others saw only danger. By nightfall, Ryland reached a wide plateau. He set up a small fire and ate his remaining food. The stars shone above, and the mountains cast long shadows across the land. He thought about what he had done. The Skyfang was no longer a symbol of impossibility. Humans had climbed it, mapped it, and survived. The mountain had tested him, and he had answered with cleverness, patience, and courage. When he returned to the human settlement at the base of the mountains, word of his success had already spread. People came to see him, to hear the story of the climb, to witness proof that humans could face the impossible and succeed. Children listened wide-eyed, inspired by a human who had done what even elves thought could not be done. Adults nodded in respect, realizing that humans had abilities that went beyond strength or magic. Cleverness, persistence, and courage could change the world. The elves eventually came down from their cliffs to speak with him. At first they were cautious, unsure if they should trust him. But Ryland's calm, honest demeanor impressed them. They listened as he explained his path, his choices, and his reasoning. They had once considered humans weak and limited. Now they saw humans as problem solvers, capable of incredible feats. Some elves even began to train alongside human scouts, hoping to learn a new way of thinking. The mountain remained as tall and sharp as ever, but its meaning had changed. No longer was it simply a barrier or a symbol of impossibility. Now it represented opportunity, challenge, and the triumph of human ingenuity. Ryland's climb had shown that the impossible was not permanent. With thought, patience, and courage, humans could achieve what others only dreamed of. Ryland himself became a legend. Scouts followed in his footsteps, carefully mapping routes and studying the mountain. The Confederation began to expand trade, bringing prosperity to regions that had once been unreachable. The elves, initially wary, learned to respect humans in a way they had never before. The Skyfang had tested them all, but in the end, it showed that humans were more than capable of rising to the challenge. Years later, children would point to the mountain and ask their parents who had first climbed it. The answer was always the same: a human scout named Ryland who had walked where no one else could, who had outthought danger, and who had shown that humans could do what others considered impossible. Ryland's climb was remembered not just for reaching the summit, but for what it proved about humanity. Humans could think, adapt, and act in ways no one else could. They could face impossible challenges and, step by careful step, turn them into triumphs. The mountain would always be there, harsh and dangerous, but it would forever carry the mark of human courage and cleverness. And so the legend of Ryland and the Skyfang passed into history, a story of a human who dared, a human who thought, and a human who succeeded where no one else could. The elves would never forget it, and humans would never stop believing in what they could achieve. The impossible had been climbed, and humanity had proven itself once again.